All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at this conversation between Joe Rogan and the hosts of the YouTube show Flagrant.
Yeah, this is a pretty interesting one.
Yeah, and it's a casual conversation, but they get into some really deep topics about comedy, podcasting, and even like technology and how it affects us.
Yeah, it's wild how Rogan just casually drops these like super strong opinions.
Yeah.
Like right off the bat, he kind of goes after the Flagrant guys for their studio setup.
Oh yeah, what was that about?
He's like, you guys are overcomplicating podcasting. It's like he's a real purist, like he thinks podcasting should be raw and unfiltered.
Back in the day.
Exactly. He even jokes about them needing dead air before the show to fit in with the industry norms.
Which is hilarious, right?
Yeah.
But it does make you think,
Totally.
has podcasting lost some of its soul as it's gotten more popular and more mainstream?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And it kind of ties into this whole conversation they have about cancel culture and how comedy's changing.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, Rogan's been through it all with some of his guests, right?
Absolutely. So he's really passionate about honesty, especially now with social media being able to twist things so easily.
Right. It's like he's warning us to be careful about the information we consume and be wary of those, like, black and white narratives that get thrown around.
That's a good point, for sure.
And speaking of things that make you think critically, they go pretty deep on technology and how it impacts our interactions.
Oh, yeah, like how we're constantly online.
They even talk about this thing called the Dunbar number.
What?
Yeah, the Dunbar number. Have you heard of this?
No, fill me in.
Okay, so it's this idea that our brains can only handle a certain number of, like, meaningful relationships.
Okay, interesting.
Like, there's a limit.
So, like, how many friends can we really have?
Exactly. And they're saying that all this online interaction could be overloading our brains, leading to more conflict and less connection in real life.
Whoa, that's kind of deep.
Right. Makes you think. And then, get this, they bring up the stoned ape theory, which I had never even heard of.
Oh, yeah, Terence McKenna's theory.
Yeah. So basically, it suggests that magic mushrooms, psilocybin, played a role in the evolution of human consciousness.
Yeah, it's pretty out there, but Rogan seems to be into it.
Totally. And they even bring up Dennis McKenna, Terrence's brother.
Right, the ethnopharmacologist.
Yeah, he's a legitimate scientist.
Right.
So it adds like another layer to the conversation.
It's interesting because Dennis doesn't necessarily say the theory is true, but he does acknowledge that there's still so much we don't know about how the human brain developed so quickly.
Yeah, it's a mystery for sure.
And the stoned ape theory offers a pretty unique, albeit controversial, take on it.
For sure.
Yeah.
And from there, they get to these primal instincts that we still have, even in modern society.
Like what?
Well, Rogan talks about the thrill we get from fishing.
Fishing.
Yeah, and he connects it back to our ancestors who relied on it for survival.
So it's like a deep-rooted instinct?
Right? Like we get that dopamine rush because for our ancestors, catching a fish meant feeding their family.
That's wild.
I know, it's like our evolutionary past is still shaping our behavior today, even in ways we don't realize.
That's fascinating.
Okay, so now this is where it gets really interesting for me. Rogan starts talking about the kind of people who are drawn to comedy.
Oh, yeah.
And he says that the best comedians often come from unconventional backgrounds, people who have a unique perspective on the world.
Like they've seen things differently.
Exactly. He calls them outcast comedians.
Outcast comedian.
Yeah, and he specifically mentions Sam Kinison and Joey Diaz.
Oh, wow. Both known for their, raw, unfiltered humor.
Exactly. They're not afraid to push boundaries.
And Rogan draws a parallel between these outcast comedians and the thrill of hunting.
Interesting connection.
He's saying they both tap into this primal need to confront and overcome challenges.
So, like great comedy, like a successful hunt, requires courage, resilience, and a willingness to face the unknown.
Yeah, it's pretty thought-provoking.
And this actually ties into another theme that pops up throughout the conversation, celebrating the success of others.
Which is interesting because the entertainment industry can be so competitive.
Totally.
Yeah.
But Rogan's really pushing back against that.
Yeah.
He's advocating for a collaborative spirit.
Like a rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing.
Exactly. He even gets personal and shares a story about Missy Shore.
Oh, the owner of the Comedy Store.
Yeah, he speaks about her with so much respect and admiration, highlighting how dedicated she was to creating a space for comedians to express themselves freely.
It's a cool story.
It is. And it leads him to reflect on his own role in the whole Carlos Mencia plagiarism controversy.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was a big deal.
It was. And he admits to feeling some guilt about how that all went down.
So he's acknowledging the negativity that surrounded that situation.
Yeah. And he's expressing a desire to create a more supportive and encouraging environment within the comedy community.
Which I think circles back to that idea of gratitude he keeps coming back to.
Absolutely. He sees gratitude as this powerful force, not only in his personal life, but also in his career and his interactions with others.
Makes sense.
And then, just when you think they've covered everything, they drop a bombshell. Aliens.
Of course. Gotta have some aliens in a Rogan conversation.
Right. He tells this story about having dinner with Bob Lazar.
The guy who claims he worked on alien spacecraft.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And while Rogan doesn't necessarily say he believes Lazar, he does admit that the universe is so vast that alien life seems pretty likely.
Yeah, it's a wild story, especially since Rogan's usually pretty skeptical.
Totally. And then they switch gears again and start talking about Elon Musk's Neuralink project.
Oh, wow, that's a whole other rabbit hole.
Right. And this is where Rogan's fascination with technology and consciousness really comes through. He's excited about the potential of Neuralink, but also kind of wary of the risks.
Yeah, it's like mind-blowing technology.
He even describes Neuralink as a potential pathway to a group consciousness.
Which sounds both amazing and terrifying.
Totally. It raises all these questions about the future of humanity and our relationship with technology.
No kidding. And just as they're getting deep into those philosophical implications, they take another sharp turn.
What do they talk about now?
Joe Coy and Chelsea Handler's relationship.
Of course. Got to have some celebrity gossip.
It's a funny moment that kind of lightens the mood.
Yeah, and it shows the dynamic between Rogan and the flagrant hosts.
For sure. But then they circle back to gratitude, with Rogan sharing a story about his ex-girlfriend who was a talented comedian but decided to leave the industry.
That's interesting.
It's a poignant story that shows how tough it can be to make it in comedy.
And it leads Rogan to reiterate his point about creating a more supportive environment for comedians.
Yeah, he believes that comedy thrives when it's a collective effort.
Makes sense.
And he ends by expressing his gratitude to the flagrant hosts for their contributions to comedy, praising their authenticity and style.
It's a really nice way to wrap up a super wide-ranging conversation.
I agree. They covered a lot of ground, from podcasting to aliens to gratitude.
It's amazing what can come up in a casual chat.
Definitely. It just shows the power of open and honest conversation.
And it gives us a lot to think about.
For sure. Yeah, it really is amazing how they just bounce around from topic to topic.
Right. It's like you're eavesdropping on a really interesting conversation.
Totally. And it's cool how Rogan keeps bringing it back to that idea of gratitude, especially in an industry that's so competitive.
Yeah, it's like he's saying there's enough success to go around.
Exactly. And he's really passionate about supporting those outcast comedians, the ones who bring a fresh perspective.
He keeps using that term outcast.
Right. It's like he sees it as a positive thing.
Like a badge of honor.
Yeah. Like it means you're not afraid to be different.
And it goes back to that connection he made between those comedians and hunting. Both needing courage and resilience.
Yeah, like they're both willing to face the unknown.
He keeps talking about Sam Kinison, praising his raw style.
Oh yeah, Kinison was definitely one of a kind.
He even called Kinison's comedy tent revival preacher comedy, which is so perfect.
It really captures that energy.
But then he talks about Bill Hicks, who is also known for his dark humor.
And get this, Rogan actually says he didn't like Hicks.
Really? That's surprising.
Yeah, it seems like he thought Hicks was a bit too preachy.
Like he was trying to deliver a message instead of just being funny.
Exactly. And Rogan's all about that authenticity, even if it's controversial.
He even tells a story about seeing Hicks bomb at a club with a super dark bit.
Ouch.
Yeah. But even then, Rogan recognized Hicks' commitment to his vision.
It's like he respected his dedication.
Totally. And he sees a similar quality in Joey Diaz.
Oh man, Diaz is a wild one.
He calls him pure chaos.
So true.
He tells this funny story about Diaz eating all the snacks on the set of news radio.
Classic Diaz.
I know, right? It's like he doesn't care about the rules.
And Rogan admires that.
Definitely. He's all about those larger-than-life characters. But they also talk about how these outcast comedians often tap into universal truths, even if they do it in a weird way.
Like what?
Well, he brings up his bit about countries with bad human rights records having the best food.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic Rogan bit.
It's so provocative, but also kind of true.
Yeah, it makes you think.
And he talks about comedy as a form of temporary insanity.
Temporary insanity.
Yeah, like it's a way to express those crazy thoughts we all have, but don't usually say out loud.
I like that.
And he's really adamant about not censoring ourselves, about letting those dangerous thoughts come out through comedy.
But that brings up the question of boundaries, right?
Yeah, where do you draw the line?
Exactly. And Rogan seems to think that comedy loses its power when it gets too safe.
It's like he's saying cancel culture might be making comedy more dangerous in a way because comedians have to be more subversive.
It's an interesting thought.
And then he brings it back to gratitude again.
Of course.
He talks about how lucky he feels to be able to do what he loves.
Yeah, and how he wants to help others find their way in comedy.
Right, it goes back to that collaborative spirit.
Totally. And he shares this story about his ex-girlfriend, who was a great comedian but decided to quit.
What happened?
It's a kind of sad story, actually. It just shows how tough the industry can be.
Especially for women.
Yeah, and it reinforces Rogan's point about needing more support in the comedy world.
It's like he wants to create a space where everyone can thrive.
And he ends by thanking the Flagrant guys for their contributions, praising their style.
It's a really nice moment.
It is.
The conversation was all over the place.
Totally. But it was packed with insights.
It really highlighted Rogan's values.
Yeah, like honesty, gratitude, and supporting those who are different.
It's a good reminder for all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool to hear him just talk so openly, you know.
Yeah, it's like we're getting a peek into how his burn works.
And he doesn't hold back, even when he knows some people might disagree.
Exactly. Like, he's not afraid to go against the grain.
Which kind of brings us back to that outcast comedian thing.
Yeah, like he really values people who are willing to challenge the norm.
Yeah, and to be themselves, even if it makes people uncomfortable.
Totally. And that goes back to his whole thing about being honest.
Right, like real connection comes from being genuine, even if it's not perfect.
So as we wrap this up,
Yeah, it's been a wild ride.
what really stuck with you?
I think it's Rogan's focus on gratitude and collaboration, you know, like being supportive instead of competitive.
That's a big one. And it's not just about comedy, right?
Totally. It's about appreciating what you have and helping others succeed.
Exactly. And finding people who inspire you and support you.
We also talked about how comedy is changing in this digital age.
Yeah, Rogan thinks cancel culture might actually be making comedy more edgy.
He's like a weird paradox for him.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's important to be mindful, but also to protect free speech.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
Rogan's perspective is always interesting.
And it reminds us that we can learn something from every conversation.
Yeah, even casual ones.
So here's something to ponder. How do you think Rogan's own experiences have shaped his views?
That's a good question. We all have our own unique perspectives.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep those conversations flowing.